there. Unify output. Not showing it. Yep. Sorry, yep.
Sometimes they need to give us more space.
Yep. Cool. Let's try to form here. So that.
So we're going to have a short lead, eh? Sometimes I'm well, there are things that can follow. Yeah.
All right, now we're in a really low resolution. Yes, blue sheet will work fine.
Now we're just going to send one of them around.
Yes, I've already. Yeah, thank you. And going back down. Yeah, everything else is still saying no signal. Worked perfectly fine in the other room yesterday. I'll have to try this room. All right. Unified. Oh, go with that. Go with that with a box and then see it to there.
Yeah, but that's quite the only.
So for y'all on Meet Echo, so you know, we are having technical problems with projection and stuff. So we'll be a bit. We'll let you know.
Yeah.
Also, so you know, you on Meet Echo outnumber us in the room actually. Not if we count Alexei, but let's not count Alexei because he's
No, we don't.
the
We
AD.
count him. So that's absolutely nothing. Spare HDMI cable here. Yeah. Are there other inputs on the phone? Yeah, thank you. All right, people on Meet Echo, we're getting another HDMI cable and we'll see if that helps. You're putting it back in front. Cool. you have another computer that we know has worked as an output for it? There, we can see. Oh, sorry. Up a little. Something in the box.
With observations.
So we pulled the cable, I meant to see if it was the cable or the yeah.
Yes, we've decided that this is going to be a short session, but it's going to start very, very late. So
So apologies to those.
we now have two AV people working on the problem.
Yeah.
Yes. That's a good point.
We could just get everyone to bring up the slides on their own laptops to follow along.
It may actually be an option at some point quite soon. No. Thank you.
So we have some communication.
Yeah.
With the nice people on the screen.
All right.
Three. We now have three AV people working on the problem.
All right.
Soon they will outnumber the people in the room as well.
All true. All right. Yep. Okay. It says I have a display. It even lets me mouse off into it.
That sounds like it ought to be promising.
Yeah, well, it had it all along.
Yeah, well, I didn't say it was promising.
It's just not coming out the other end. Okay. Yep. I think your laptop destroyed it. It sent it some HDMI signal that made it decide not to pass anything forever again. Yeah. All right, while we're waiting for the slides to work, if you want to find the slides that are available on the meeting info page for this, you can get up your own copy of them and worst cases that we follow along.
Yep, I just asked on Jabber if anyone does not have access to them.
I can watch, see what you're doing and just copy it.
Aha.
Ah, there we go. What do you know?
It looks like we have ignition.
Now, will it work with this? Well, it would be ideal if we can. No, I plugged it to a different. If we can.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. We
Okay.
believe we have a slide up that's a big plain white slide with a big Jmap in the middle of it. Do you on Meet Echo see that? Liftoff, says Ken. Okay. Life is good. But
All right.
Jeff says he does not. Sorry, Jeff PC. Jeff is Joseph. Okay.
Thank you.
He's good now too. So all right, we're going. So I'm going to go up to
Okay.
the front like a good doobie here.
All right, this is cutting in and out, so let's be careful not to touch Neil's laptop. Yes, we're back again. Okay, fingers crossed. Don't break anything, Barry. All right, everybody, welcome to the slightly delayed by about 15 minutes Jmap session at IETF 100. The blue sheets have, I think, made their way around the 5 people in the room, and we have another 5 on Meet Echo. I'm Bron. Barry is arriving at the table as well. The note well should be appearing on your screen right about now. If you can't see it, there's plenty of places to find it. And let's get on with the agenda. So we're going to start with an overview of the changes since the last time. I think this is, the lack of people in the room is probably indicative of the fact that there aren't that many outstanding issues that there's going to be a large amount of debate about. But yep, Alexi's about to hop up to the microphone.
I'm creating, excuses. There is also DO working group running in parallel and SOG, which is like the worst possible combination ever.
So the first question is, how the hell did that happen?
Well, SOG is,
SOG and DO should not overlap because DO is security related. DO and
it's
us,
more DNS related. Wow.
Yes, but it's HTTPS. DO and us shouldn't overlap. I mean, this was just that doesn't matter. Right? We shouldn't go on about it.
Right.
Regardless, let's hand over to Neil to talk about what's changed since IETF 99.
Okay. So first of all, just going to have a look at what's the major changes in core. So one of them is patch updates. Updates have always been a patch in that you didn't have to send all of the properties of an object. You just had to send the ones that changed, but you did have to send the whole value of the top level of, property. And this was an issue for things like keywords and mailboxes, because you'd have to send the complete set, which was a bit wasteful in terms of bandwidth, and also meant that if another client had changed one keyword in between, you would blat that change if you were just naively writing the whole thing out rather than and not checking that the state hadn't changed under you. So with patch updates, basically it looks like this. So you can see we've got keyword /$flagged being set to true, which is basically JSON pointer format. I can't remember the RSC, but it's just another standardized format for going into the property of what you're changing. And the patch format is defined such that you can also you can include just the whole object and the top level properties if you want, or you can include the detailed minimal patches, and the server processes it the same way either way. And that's pretty much all there is to say about that, but just pause for a moment to see if there's any comments. Alexi just asked what's the big hash slide looking at thing. That's the ID of the object you're updating.
That's actually the SHA-1 of the RFC 822 bytes in that.
This example was copied straight out of the network panel from the Jmap proxy, but it could be anything. It's an opaque string. In this case, it's a hash of something. But anyway, are there any comments or questions on this from the people on Meet Echo? Is someone monitoring Jabber or something?
I'm watching Meet Echo.
Okay.
It's quiet.
Cool. Let's just move on then. So the other major... Great. +1 from Lexi. Yeah.
Maybe we should just bring the microphone over to Alexa.
The other major change is introducing this idea of back references for method arguments.
Hey.
So the idea here is there was quite a few methods where we're having to special case extra arguments for things like fetching the messages from the message list or fetching the threads from the message list. And all of this was really just to allow you to make implicit method calls and so avoid round trips, because you need some of the results of the previous method in order to make the next call. So with the back references, we have basically simple syntactic transformation, which is really easy to implement on the server, but it actually gives you just as much power and more from before, and means we could remove a whole load of special cases so that actually a lot of the methods become simpler. So here's an example to actually explain more what I'm talking about. So this is split over 2 pages because the slides are quite small, but essentially what we're doing here is fetching the first 30 threads in a particular mailbox and fetching the headers for every message in each of those threads of those first 30. So the first thing we do is get message list with the filter just of a particular mailbox. That's the idea of the mailbox there, if you're not familiar with the Jmap filter format. Sorted date descending, collapsed by thread, so that we only return each thread once at the first position of its message, and we limit that to 30. So that gets us the 30 IDs of those first 30 messages in that message list. The next one is slightly odd, but you can see here how it works. So we have a hash before the argument name, and you can do this before any argument name. And so that's very easy to scan through the arguments and check. And then it's telling you which of the previous methods to look for the result in, and then the path into the response from that to look through. So result of 0, so we can look back and see that was what was tagged. The get message list call was tagged with 0. That's the ID of that method call. And then we would look at the IDs path in the result, and that is an array of IDs. And that then becomes the IDs argument for get messages. So it looks slightly weird when you're looking at it on in the slides, I think, but it's actually really easy to implement and gives you a lot of extra power to reduce round trips and make things more efficient.
And so we have
Yes.
a comment from Jabber, possible issue, a Jmap call containing both IDs and pound IDs.
This is the argument name, so there obviously are no arguments at the moment that start with a pound, and I don't think anyone is likely to define one, and we can certainly make sure that you don't. That's all you're looking through. You're iterating through the arguments to a method.
In the same way that it's used for ID replacement for back references within objects, that leading character can easily be defined as not allowed to be used for anything else.
Do we have any further comments on the Meet Echo? Okay, I'll just keep continuing for a short time then. So what we've done, so the second one was fetching, basically we want to know what the thread ID for each of those messages is. So we do a get messages call, just fetching the thread ID property for each of those for that. That's the one slightly weird bit. And then after that, we're simply getting the threads. So for each of those thread IDs, we've got a back reference there to the thread IDs result of the previous thing. We're fetching the threads, which is the list of messages in each of those threads. And then finally, we're doing our get message with the header properties we want, back referencing to those message IDs in the threads to fetch all the messages. So as I said, I think it does look a bit weird when you first see it in the slide, but having now tried implementing this and playing around with it, it seems to work quite well and actually simplifies code we found on both, particularly on the back end, because it reduces the special cases that used to have to exist to get the network efficiency.
So continuing from Jabber, Robert says core spec should reject requests as invalid that contain foo and pound foo on the same level. That was in response to
yes.
Jeff. And Chris says, question is, would the server have to merge pound IDs and IDs and compute the result on the merged list?
No. As Robert said, it'd be invalid arguments error immediately if you try and include both. And it's very easy to check that you don't have both. You can include this if you want to back reference. Otherwise, you just give the explicit one. There's no merging, nothing tricky like that. Any other questions on this? Doesn't look like it. Cool.
I'll interrupt you if somebody perks up.
Okay, great. Cool. Well, let's move on. The remaining overview stuff of what's changed since Prague. Push support. There's not a lot to say about this. It was just mainly kind of refinements to what was there before. Referencing in web encryption support, which is going to be needed if you're going to use this in a browser. That just references a different RFC, or will be an RFC before this is finalized. Martin Thompson's writing, and ensures that we are conforming to what's required in RFC 8030 for to be able to be used as part of that standard push ecosystem. The other form of push, which is the event source, has changed slightly in that the client can now pass some query parameters, one of which says this is kind of long polling, so just close the connection every time you actually push something. And the other one is to let the client determine how long the server, what interval the server should send pings down the event source if there have been no events. These are to allow clients to detect that they've got a live connection to the server, and the concerns were raised before that the trouble with event source sometimes is that you have proxies in between, which mean that if they're buffering proxies, you never get the response until the connection is closed because they're buffering too much in between, and so this sometimes doesn't work in some corporate environments. So with these options, the client can look out for the pings, and if it determines it's not getting the pings through, can fall back long polling, which normally always works because you're closing the connection, and therefore the proxies flush their buffer, and you get the data through. And so it still works as a push channel. It's just slightly less efficient on the network. And so with those changes as a set, I think push is pretty much finished. So any comments on push? Nothing coming? Great. And finally, authentication. This is a big issue we've discussed in a few cases. Basically, we've taken out the new authentication stuff that was in the Jmap core. It's kind of out of scope and makes it much more difficult to get through the spec. This is a problem that's not really just tied to Jmap. So the spec basically just now says it's HTTP, so you need HTTP auth to authenticate connections. What that is will obviously depend on the service, probably basic in some cases or bearer with OAuth in certain other cases, and that's pretty much the same situation as we currently have in IMAP. It's no better, but no worse as well.
Any interest in, this is Barry, any interest in implementing any of the HTTP auth working group experimental authentication mechanisms?
I'm not sure which one the experimental ones are. I'd have to go.
Look up the HTTP auth working group, which
Okay.
is now closed. But it produced, I think, 3 experimental specs.
Interesting. I mean, I'd certainly be interested in looking at those and doing some experiments with them. In terms of the specification, I think whatever that is, it would still have to be separate to Jmap. Like, it is an independent part. It's not required, and tying the two together would be a mistake, I think.
That's fair. So Ken says Scram, which is, that's the sort of thing that we're talking about. Is one of the experimental HTTP mechanisms is related to Scram. So,
Ken Grasberski, Google. Could you consider like not supporting like basic auth because of all the issue basic auth, and really like that's a use case where you want to use some mechanism like OAuth and other, and avoid the nightmares of basic.
right, that's what I was getting at. With
Yeah.
my question.
So the kind of the history of this is that we were desperately trying to avoid basic auth, but mandating OAuth doesn't work because there are too many situations for email that's not necessarily viable. We could prohibit basic, but again, it's going to be hand waving, and it's going to be used in situations to an extent. Like if you're so obviously there's situations in the back end, like on the internal network sometimes, where it's being proxied through, and at that point it's going to use some other auth system that's could just be basic or something. But the other issue, the main issue is if you're random ISP, set up an email service, mail client has to connect to it. So kind of what are your options for allowing authentication? Well, there's basic or there's OAuth pretty much. But the trouble with OAuth is there's now some new standards to do auto discovery, but just there's no email clients. I don't know how likely it is people are going to support all of these things in order to be able to auto discover the OAuth settings, auto register the client and stuff. They can't pre-register with every email service out there. They're going to pre-register with Gmail and Yahoo and stuff, so that they don't need the auto discovery system, but they can't do that with every ISP.
Yeah, I agree that we can't require OAuth, but I think this is a a real loss from coming from IMAP where we had SCRAM.
Except that
And,
in the vast majority of places, no one uses that in IMAP.
so anyway, Chris says, while I'm obviously a fan of SCRAM plus TLS, the more important problem to solve is client-specific token bootstrap.
Like, could you consider forbidding basic auth?
Forbidding what, sorry?
Instead of mandating
Right.
auth,
You must
can
not use
forbid,
basic.
Basic.
This is a
Oh, well,
philosophical.
this-
Sorry.
I was saying, based with that, there is obviously, it forbids not TLS. Everything has to be over at TLS, but it's. I think.
I didn't verify, like, upon then you have like XSRF type, you have all kind of all kind of vulnerabilities that are possible, like impossibility to log out, a lot of nightmares with basic.
Yeah.
And really,
We
prefer like avoiding altogether.
This is what we've been trying to do, except that we also don't want to be defining a new authentication specification because that's out of scope, and we can't. There doesn't seem to be anything we can just say you must, like saying you must use OAuth is not practical either. Like we can say you must not use basic, you must use a bearer token, and how you get that bearer token is not necessarily via OAuth, but that still leaves open if you're writing a client.
Yep.
Okay, I need a bearer token. How the hell do I get this bearer token?
And bearer tokens suck as well. So
That's another
I
issue.
suggest that you post to the SAG list, SAAG mailing list, and ask for somebody to look at this document from a security point of view and comment on what you might do. But because what I'm afraid is that when this gets to the IASG, it's going to get pounced on by the security ADs if we're doing basic auth.
I think we probably need some security considerations.
We can-
Realistically, so there was a recent document from Mile, which is, again, it's sort of ATOM pub-based HTTP protocol. It doesn't talk, it hand-waved about authentication as well. It sort of said, out of scope.
So the alternative then is, could we just drop HTTP entirely and say that you must use this over HTTPS?
Oh, sorry, no, it's already must be over HTTPS.
Oh, okay.
But
Then
that's a side issue. It's
it's not sufficient to solve everything, but it may be sufficient to get past the initial issue. So anyway, Chris says, basic over TLS is the only thing that's likely to interoperate as long as authentication is out of scope. So it's probably the mandatory to implement for interoperability. And I guess I agree with Chris on that. Bearer tokens are better than password over TLS for mobile devices, as long as there's a way to expire the bearer token if the device is lost.
So I would actually answer that this is what's happening in the real world, is that a lot of big providers now are issuing an app-specific password to each device and saying your bearer token is your username plus this, because HTTP basic auth is basically a bearer token in two parts. And part of the bearer token is your username, part of the bearer token is this long-lived app password that you can then cancel when your device is lost. Because canceling a token is still going to be saying this is no longer usable. And that's where the world is going at the moment, because that's what's available.
well, yeah. I mean, OAuth is basically a nicer way of setting up that app password, so the user doesn't have to manually mess around. They just log in with their normal credentials, and that's all handled in the background. This is not an issue that is specific to Jmap. It is an issue with any HTTP API, and so the solution, I don't know, is I don't think that we can solve this just within this working group.
I think, unless anyone objects, I'm going to request an early sector review on it, so that while we're finishing up the document, we can get any comments from the security area about it.
Sure, that's fine. I certainly think certainly the security considerations section will need a strong bit about basic, but I think the trouble is that if we forbid it, we are basically removing the only real interoperable
Okay.
option
So-
for a lot of ISPs.
Please take a stab at writing out the security considerations as a priority.
Yep.
When you're done with that, I'll ask the security directorate for an early review.
Sure, there's already quite a few in there. I'll add the basic bit in. Yep. Okay, so those are the main changes since last time. So let's look through the remaining issues. There's not actually too many real substantial issues to go. We're hoping to get most of these resolved by March and the next IETF in London, and then hopefully we can actually do interop testing at the hackathon and IETF London as well beforehand if people have got fairly complete implementations of a fairly finished spec. So let's have a look what's remaining in core. So one thing we need to do is make sure we have sorted our plan for versioning and extensions, which is obviously always going to happen with any API. And my rough plan for this looks a bit like this. So at the moment, your method calls are an array, which is what you post to the API. We'll wrap that array in a top-level object, which lets us add various kind of metadata properties, if you like, to the whole request. Chris Newman, I know, has raised ideas of adding extensions on this in the future for things like you must commit the whole thing atomically or things like that. But for now, the main thing is that we can add a using property, which behaves a lot like Civ. It's an opt-in to specifications. You have to opt in as a client to everything you wish to use. If you don't opt in, the server behaves as though it doesn't support it, which gives you fairly decent, like IMAP enable or Civ. The server advertises which specs it supports in the capabilities object, which is fetched at the beginning with your basically information about the session. Once you have some kind of authentication token, however that is, you can fetch this object that has information about which endpoints to hit for the resources and the capabilities of the server. And the capabilities object basically is a key of the spec name, or preferably, I think, a URL to the specification itself, so that if you're just trying to see what a server supports, you see something you don't recognize, you can just follow the link and find out about the spec, which would be quite nice. And then the value of that in the capabilities object is an object with various information about that spec. So, for example, for the mail spec, the capabilities object includes things like max mailboxes and stuff like that. So that's the general plan. It's not too complicated. I think it's based on existing solutions that work, and it gives you a way to move forward while not breaking old clients, which is the main thing you want. Any objections or alternative proposals or ideas on that?
General shrugging in the room for those in Meet Echo.
Yeah, I think we've discussed this a few times before, and I think this actually seems to be.
Doesn't this assume that URLs are stable forever, says Jeff?
No, not at all. I mean, the capabilities, if your capability name is a URL, yeah. The thing is that so the specification will define its capability name, which doesn't have to be a URL. I'm just suggesting it would be nice if they are. And for things like RFCs, you can have a canonical URL, I think, which is, sure, forever's a long time, but can be reasonably stable. I think
I presume you're when you say URL here, you mean URI, right?
Yeah, being loose and fast with terms.
Right.
But
so
it's not kind of an
have to be a
important.
locator.
Yeah, it's not important to this functioning. It can perfectly function without it being a URI. It's just, I think that would be nice if that's a suggested thing for future extensions, because then it helps developers who are like examining a new server, if they come across something they don't recognize, to find the documentation on that of what the server can do.
My question wasn't URL versus URI, but what my question wasn't URI versus non-URI. Now that we're clear that when you say URL, you mean URI, it's okay for this not to be a locator. It can be something that doesn't resolve to anything, right? So a URN.
Yes, standard ones can be URNs and can be actually allocated in IETF namespace, which is quite common for lots of protocols.
So I think that works now.
The main thing I think
extensions will be
have to be in your domain, you own, so that it enforces namespacing. Yeah, that was the other idea of that, is enforces namespacing through that. Okay. Good. Okay, and this is really kind of the only other thing in core. I think core is looking fairly good now. And this is a bit of bike shedding, really, but there's some inconsistencies in the standard method names. We've got plurals for get foos and set foos, but we have a singular foo for get foo updates, get foo list updates, which is both aesthetically a little bit annoying and also makes it harder to programmatically generate these if you're kind of doing it automatically by just giving it one type name and having it synthesize what the method names are, because you have to know how to pluralize something, and mailboxes has ES as opposed to something else. So I think it would just be nice if we made this more consistent.
Your proposal is actually not to add s, just keep it as is.
I'm proposing to keep everything as plural, but then you still only have to specify one. The main thing is the server, you would never have to try and auto-convert between
Just
one and the other.
specify foo and everything else is.
You specify foods, and then, so these are some suggestions.
So everything was, yeah, so like get mailboxes, banana.
Yes.
Mailboxes.
So everything will be mailboxes rather than mailbox.
Even more shrug, but whatever.
We could try and go all singular. It's arbitrary. I just think it makes sense to make it consistent and to have and to not require two forms of the same type name.
Does anyone object to letting Neil figure it out and accept what he comes up with? Sold.
Great. This is bike shedding at its best. We can whiz past the important bits. There's a very similar quick naming bike shedding issue on email. We're on to the mail spec now, which is simply that it's been proposed we rename the message object to email because there's some confusion around the fact that you have an ID on the message object, and that's a Jmap ID and not the RFC 5322 message ID and with terminology. So that's just avoids that confusion because then it becomes email ID and stuff. Yeah. So great. Move on from the bike shedding stuff. This is the main issue I think still to resolve, and so this is hopefully what we can hash out here and on the mailing list between now and March, which is the message format in JSON of the RFC 5322. So I think the headers bit of this is fine and doesn't seem to have any objections. It gives you past forms of a lot of the headers, which makes it easier for the client to deal with, like getting the from as an array of objects with a name and email property in rather than having to pass the string. The main, I think, thing that we really are not sure about at the moment is converting the body into, and what form does that take? Is it just some kind of JSON representation of a MIME tree, which is kind of what the Gmail API does, or is it closer to what clients generally use, which is clients generally present a message as some kind of body, which is a text thing or HTML representation, and then some attachments, which are files associated with that. Then, of course, even how you convert between them, there's some ambiguity. What is an attachment? We've had some discussion on the list the last few days. This is not quite as simple as it sounds. And so I think this is kind of the main thing of what we want from this. Do we want both options or one of these? What should it look like? I think I'd kind of like to open the floor to opinions here.
So my question: why would not? Why should we
Please,
not?
please say your name for remote people.
Nikhil Izborsky, Google. So my question: why would you do something different than providing the original MIME structure? Because the point is you want to provide like the mail data store transfer. So you want to actually respect that rather than try to selectively select the field that you want to propagate.
So there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, it just makes it easier for client authors, because I said that this does not map to the presentation that is used in clients generally, which is body plus attachments. The second reason is it also makes it easier to optimize fetching. So to optimize the network usage, I want to be able to say, return me just the HTML body representation of each of these messages without having to fetch some kind of overall structure object, interrogate that, work out which bits, and individually fetch each of those. That becomes a lot more both overhead and complexity to fetch what I need to just display this message in a client.
Nevertheless, I think you always have an option to get back the original message, being able to rebuild.
Yes,
so this is one of the things we're talking about. Yeah, whether we basically provide both options, so the client can request which it wants, whether it wants kind of the MIME structure or whether it wants some interpretation by the server of that, so that it doesn't have to bother passing that. That's what we're discussing, basically. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, the Fastmail web interface intermediate code, which I've worked on for this, fetches the body structure for all the messages it's interested in, and then it goes through and finds the one where the same part number is going to be of interest to it, and then it does a fetch on that subset of messages for each subset to actually fetch that part of the message so that it can generate the data to display on the web interface. And it has to actually go through and filter the body structure and say, well, it's part number 1.1 on these ones, and it's part number 1.3 on these. That's quite a complex set of code to find the display
I-
text for each
I
message.
confirm because, well, I just wrote the same thing in our implementation, which is not Jmap yet, but it's, yeah, exactly the same problem. And once you start dealing with multi-part alternative, multi-part mix, multi-part related, all arbitrary nesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, if you want just for display, I mean, returning a single blob, you know, whatever text plain or HTML, depending on what the client wants, is probably
So that's
sensible.
another question though, whether a single blob or one thing we noticed when we looked at implementation for this is actually it's kind of an array of blobs that we get. So it's a flat array, but for example, if you had a message centers with HTML and text alternatives, and then it goes through a mailing list which adds a text-only signature as an extra part after it, then if you're synthesizing this into a single property, you'd have to convert that to HTML and then append that to the HTML to get an HTML version. But then appending that to HTML is hard because you don't want to stick it just after the end of the, like literally just append them, because that's actually not valid. And you can do this, and that's actually what we do, and it kind of works if you throw it at a browser. But it's, yeah, it might be nicer just to return the array, because the client is easy to render each HTML text bit and then just pop them all together on the screen, potentially. I don't know. So I think that's discussion. Well, that's an option to be
So
considered.
the next interesting can of worms this raises is whether you have a set messages capability to add something more structured than just a single text or single HTML part.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with this actually, I'm sort of on the opposite side, because you probably want to have a bit more control on the client. If the client, I mean, make the simple case simple, but if the client wants something more elaborate.
Yeah, I think it would. The set messages would have to mirror whatever we do for get messages. Really, like it doesn't make sense to do something different there. So if the get message can either fetch a MIME structure or fetch this pass version, then I think you need to be able to do the same with set. If the client wants just to do the pass version, does that. Otherwise, it can. Oh, sorry, I hit the. Sorry. We both went through it at the same time. Okay. Any comments from the online people on this?
Yeah, I have a gut feeling that we might have a bit more discussion of this on the mailing list.
Oh,
Once
yes.
people actually get their heads around this.
This is definitely going to need more discussion on the mailing list, and
But
I think I don't know. I wanted to get people to start thinking about it here, and we'll maybe send through some ideas of proposals. As I said, I think this is the meatiest issue still remaining to be resolved, so it's worth a bit of thought. The other thing that's come up, kind of related to this, although in some ways differently, is wanting to be able to fetch partial body. So suppose you had your HTML body where the server's magically worked out a single text HTML thing to represent the body, but that HTML thing could be 3 megas of text. And as a client, you only want to fetch maybe 100 kilobytes up front, especially on a constrained environment, so that you're not wasting it. And then only if the user says, yeah, I want to see the whole thing, do you bother fetching the rest. So we don't have a way of representing that at the moment in Jmap. And so whether that's part of something custom for message, or whether that becomes part of core in some way of some custom thing of return me for string, I'm not sure about that. It seems fairly limited in use case, but yeah.
that's probably one of the more useful features of IMAP, actually. So
Yeah.
I suspect, yeah.
I don't know
Even
if they can hear you. I
I-
can't hear you.
I suspect it's partial fetch is one of the more useful features of IMAP, so we probably need to do that.
So the other Neil says, every client I've worked on wants a pair of HTML attachments to actually display the message content at the UI layer. So somebody has to solve the problem at some point in the pipeline. And it's better, in my opinion, if the server can, so things like search and message body display are consistent. Chris says, the structure I prefer is main inline blob or array of inline blobs plus array of attachments. But the array of attachments has an optional question mark IMAP style MIME part number. This allows conversion between flat attachment view and MIME hierarchy. Jeff says, but that makes the server responsible for some of the presentation decisions, presuming he's going back to Neil's comment, which is, in my opinion, not a server problem. Neil says that's a fair perspective too, but it does impact consistency with search.
Hmm.
I think I tend to agree on attachments numbering. If you want any structure, we probably should use IMAP, number dot number. That would be probably the easiest way of doing it.
So does that mean you agree with Chris?
I agree with Chris, I think. And clients who don't want to use it, they will just ignore it. So
Right. Okay. So in the case, I think it's a really hard problem if you have both the server and the client trying to decide which MIME part to show. On the other hand, in particular, you have to deal with also inline attachments like CID type attachment, whether you want them or not. In the case of partial body fetch, you get something even a bigger problem. You may cut off HTML in the middle, and cut off HTML in the middle can have drastic different behavior. In particular, you may have something like server that perform some kind of abuse detection, but if the URL is cut exactly at 20 kilobytes, this actually can be a good vector for abuse, to have something different showing up in the mailbox. So
Yeah, that's a good point.
So if you start to cut things up, try to do your own job, you have to think everything again.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. There is certainly security issues that can result from chopping HTML at arbitrary points, and I don't think it's not easy for a server to chop it off and manipulate it such to guarantee it's safe in that respect. On the other hand, I mean, the client is still going to make sure it's not running scripts or anything like that. But yeah, it's
Yeah, but definitely a step of sanitization that must absolutely happen on the client.
Hmm.
But
things like URLs,
beyond
I
that-
agree. If you knew where it was going to be chopped, you could change the URL that was coming through. That's a legitimate concern.
yeah, it's actually partial might be even more interesting for attachments, especially if you sort of do progressive.
Well, attachments at the moment with current format, you just get the blob ID reference, and then you download the blob using standard HTTP, so you can chop that off wherever you want as a client,
Just use HTTP partial.
or range or whatever method you want. It's only really for stuff coming over the API, which is mainly your text body or HTML body that you might want to be able to chop off in some other way.
Someone on MeetEcho tell me on Jabber if you can hear Alexei, because in the room he's not coming through the speakers very well, but he might be coming to you. Jeff says, another option, return IMAP style structure, but the server tags certain parts as body and others as attachments. And the MUA can assemble all body parts for displaying. And Jabber says they can hear you fine, so don't worry about it.
That's an interesting idea. It might be one of the options we offer. The main tricky bit, I think that makes it very hard to optimize your network usage, which is one of the things that we've been trying to make happen, because you don't want to download all of the alternative parts if you're only going to display one. I mean, that's quite a lot of wasteful overhead, especially with large messages.
Right.
But if you only get kind of just the outline structure, you then have to make successive requests once you've decided which ones you want to fetch that data. So you end up with more round trips. So it's a trade-off. I know.
Yeah, and we're back at the IMAP case of having to, I guess, at least with get messages, you can specify a different. No, you can't specify different fields for each message anyway.
No. You're
saying for this range of.
Yes, if you have to. Well, it gets
This range
really
of IDs,
awkward if you're trying to fetch.
These things, you'd wind up with that same IMAP client problem of having to pre-parse the body structures and work out which parts you want for different subsets of the messages, and then make multiple requests.
I think you'd have to return them as blob IDs, and then you just download them all as blob IDs. And as if you had HTTP2 for your download server, that's not too bad with the overhead, even though it's lots of requests.
Yeah.
But it's, yeah.
I do like
Jeff
the
says,
idea
wouldn't
of being-
backrefs handle some of this?
Potentially, it depends on the output format that we come up with. I think we'd have to, you can't tell that until we have a bit more idea of what we want the structure to look like and what's returned. Yeah, it was possible that backrefs could help with this, but at the moment it sounds like what's being proposed is return to the client requires more processing than, we're trying not to make the back reference stuff some kind of arbitrary scripting language you can run on the server. It's just very basic syntactical transformation to get results from a previous thing. And this at the moment sounds like it'd be beyond that because it requires some kind of intelligent algorithm to determine which body parts you're interested in as a client.
Yeah, I'm just. I suppose there might be sort of different types of clients. Basic clients might just want to have like single HTML for, just extract or an array of HTML, pieces, as you say, for inline parts, and don't bother with, trying to figure out what's needed.
I think that
but
most clients would want that if that's what they can get, because as Neil said, the Apple clients all end up constructing that kind of thing internally. I know our client does that internally. As far as I can see from the display model,
we've done the same.
Yeah, it's
we basically have a bunch of renderer classes that generate HTML.
so
They are called recursively, and you only, for multi-part alternative, you only fetch whatever you can render.
yeah. So this is being done everywhere, as far as I can see, and I'm not quite sure what this non-simple client that's going to do something different is, because I haven't really seen them. I guess if you're using email not actually as email, as some kind of bus system instead, then you start to get into a point where you might want something different.
Yeah, I guess the question is whether the client wants to know, is there like two textual parts or a single textual part? Maybe it wants to put a separate delimiter between them. I don't know. I mean, that's sort of a bit obscure, but that might affect UI potentially. So maybe just getting away with an array of things might be good enough.
Yeah, I mean, I do think your client still needs to be able to request like HTML version or text version if there's alternatives, and maybe know that the other version's there, even if it doesn't fetch it. That's the other kind of thing that I don't have a solution for necessarily that's great at the moment, but yeah.
Neil says, for the raw representation, are we thinking really just pure raw, or some kind of parsed JSON representation a la what the Gmail API does?
Oh, I think some kind of path is went by raw. Certainly over the API, it would be you can fetch the structure in some kind of JSON thing, more like the Gmail API, or you can fetch this more processed version, which gives you the bodies and attachments, which we seem to think most clients are going to want.
Yeah, you can always fetch the raw RFC 822, as it's called in the IMAP standard, via the blob ID as well with an HTTP GET.
Yeah, but I would have thought if we do the API right, a lot of certainly new clients would never do that, because why write all this complicated parsing code when they don't have to? And we don't want to require that unless you're doing something really obscure. That's always there as kind of the escape hatch, so we don't have to cover every single option. We want to cover all the common things, and yeah, if you really have to, you can fetch that, but you shouldn't have to for most cases.
Yeah, raw is probably for import-export type thing,
Yes.
or something very elaborate, some kind of analysis on message. For display, you. Well, again, we can actually probably do this on the server.
Pete says signature verification, to which Alexei responded, we can do this on the server.
Yeah, obviously, if you have keys that are only on the client, then yes, you'll have to download the raw to be able to do any kind of actual verification of signatures, or even decrypting encrypted blobs potentially. That's
a good point. Yeah, there are some interesting interaction with this, my understanding.
I mean, I think this is where for now, we've kind of said that the escape hatch of the raw is kind of for handling that. But yeah, if the client is the one that's decrypting, obviously if the server is the one that has the keys, then it can just present all this anyway, it doesn't matter.
If it's only signature, the server can do all the job.
Yeah,
even if it's APECly encoded single part application / whatever, server can actually decode and present it in a MIME format, which is much nicer than doing this in the client. That's actually would be a very nice feature.
So yes,
the server can't decrypt, but the server can verify signatures.
Yeah. Okay, so that does sound like that will be valuable if we can represent that in a more higher level way.
Maybe we can add, small issue / minor feature request for SMIME signatures.
Yep. Would you like to help specify what it is you think it should look like?
Sure.
Great.
Alexei has an
Considering
action item
I was
to
just fixing this, the last week, so yeah, I have some idea.
So Alexei has an action item to provide text. Neil says, I agree. It would be very nice to have both formats for, quote, full MIME access. Having the raw representation is useful for cases where you want to move a message between two accounts, as was mentioned, import, export,
Well, there's actually
and want to perfectly preserve the original message source.
yeah. I mean, yes, if the two accounts on different servers, yes, then you would need that. I mean, if they're two accounts you have access to via the same Jmap API, there's a method just to copy them over without having to download and upload it again. But yes, that's true. So yeah, I think this is going to be, yeah, you're always going to need access to that for those kind of cases, but as far as possible, we would prefer you not to need it. Okay, I think that's been a good opening discussion of this. We'll definitely continue all this on the list. I think we'll be able to agree on something. It's not like everyone's got wildly different opinions, but there's certainly different ideas which we should have a look at, try out, see what they actually look like with real messages, and then decide on stuff. I said hopefully get this done over the next couple of months, because yeah, ideally we'll have pretty much all the issues closed off by March and start doing some interop testing then. Okay.
Chris says, for security considerations, we'll have to say something about HTML security filtering. It's safer if the server has a whitelist HTML filter by default, but that increases complexity a lot. An extension to request HTML whitelist filtering by the server would be very interesting to client authors.
Yeah, we've kind of gone away from this in that we found you can, now with more modern browsers, you can often do better filtering in the browser because you have the same DOM parser rather than a different one, which is often where bugs creep in when the DOM parser is slightly different to what actually ends up being passed in the browser. Nicholas, do you have a comment on this?
Okay, Nicholas Dvorsky, Google. Definitely suggest like having a both approach in that case, because unless a client knows exactly what's going on the server, like push displaying raw HTML will be like suicidal. You have a lot of side effects possible depending on implementation, depending on which platform you're running on. So you have to be extremely defensive. But at the same time, definitely good to also have like a client sanitizer, in particular if you have any mutation possible on the client.
Yeah, I know the difficulty we're doing on the server, again, is, as you said, you don't know what the target client is, and what's dangerous may be slightly different depending on the user agent that ends up rendering it. So I think regardless of what happens on the server, the client's always going to have to do its own filtering. And so the question is whether there's extra value in having the server do it as well, or whether we found that these days almost the server doesn't add that much value and is more likely to mess up the formatting and stuff because it doesn't have as accurate a parse tree. Now, admittedly, there are now full HTML5 compliant parsers that we could go find as well for our server, but we've tended to move towards doing this on the client. Okay. But it's a good point. We should probably still maybe discuss a bit further whether we want that as an option, but it's tricky because, again, you certainly couldn't specify a particular algorithm the server would have to use, and the client can't rely on it 100% because of that anyway. So there's a question of how much you'd win if you're writing an arbitrary client and arbitrary server, I think, with that. Okay, last couple of minor points. There's been some discussion of ACLs in the last few months. In particular, we're going to bring back some kind of mapping for an ACL on mailboxes for whether you can edit the keywords. And you need, if the message is in multiple mailboxes, you need permission on every mailbox it's in, I think, to be able to modify the keywords, because that's the only slight weirdness. But one thing that has been brought up is that the scene keyword is kind of special in IMAP. There's a lot of special casing, certainly in the Cyrus IMAP server for this versus other keywords. It's included in this computed count on the mailboxes object as unread threads and unread messages, which is actually kind of flipping the behavior because everything treats stuff as unread rather than read.
It's also included an account in IMAP. You can request the count of unseen messages as a status item.
Yep. And there's obviously a different ACL for it in IMAP as well. So kind of there are two questions that kind of raised for this. Firstly, do we want to keep a separate ACL for this in Jmap 2 or just merge it with single ACL for all keywords? The second question comes from that. If it's a separate ACL, does it actually make more sense to take this out of keywords and map it as a separate isUnread property on the message object? Because that means your ACL affects one particular property rather than kind of various sub-bit of that. And also just because it seems to be quite special in various other ways, maybe it's special enough that we take it out of keywords. I think one of the downsides of this is it does mean there will have to be more duplication of things like the message list filter and search, where you have things like is all in thread. The all in thread has keyword, some in thread has keyword. You're going to need to mirror that with all in thread is unread, some in thread is unread, etc. So that is a little bit of kind of duplicative stuff that ends up there. But any opinions on this?
Alexei, as far as ACL, slight preference for keeping parity with IMAP ACL spec.
Okay.
For people who implemented it, just makes it slightly easier. But of course, your specific server can always bundles writes. So if you're writing one from scratch, you probably don't want to have them separate anyway. So you just, or not, you know.
Yeah. Okay, so slight preference for at least having the separate ACL.
And about separating it as a separate property, a bit ambivalent, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm a bit ambivalent as well, I think. Some ways I like it, in some ways I think it's just going to be a bit annoying having it separate. I don't know.
Well, the only issue is if you are not allowed to see keywords, you don't want that to prevent you from knowing whether a message is seen or not. That's the concern.
But the ACL is about writing it, not about seeing it, I think.
Well, so the other way around then, if you can't set keywords, does that mean, yeah, there's a reason it was separated in IMAP, so that you can view a message and have the scene flag set without being able to, do the other keywords. So it's
sure, but you could enforce that on the server where you try and set the keywords property. If you try and change anything other than scene, it gets rejected if you don't have that ACL, and vice versa. It doesn't need to be a separate property to have it as a separate ACL. It's just maybe that'd be nicer in terms of how it maps.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Any the people online got opinions on this, or is this another kind of just ambivalent pick something issue?
Can you remind me of somewhat related? Do we have deleted flag?
No, there's no deleted flag.
I'm in favor of it being a separate property. It's Bron here. Largely because I think it's simpler, harder to get wrong.
This will affect search.
Yes.
Is it a problem?
It will affect search in that you need to.
Well, you will have to special case searching for seen unseen flag as opposed to just. I'm asking. I'm not sure it's a big deal, but just sort of pointing out that it will.
Well, I mean, and the main thing is, it makes the mapping from IMAP slightly more complicated, I guess, because you're mapping a keyword to a specific property rather than just mapping them straight to the keywords property. But it's not.
It's only one special case. If there were like, even two is already slightly more annoying, but if just one, it's just about bearable.
And Chris says it was separated in IMAP because of the idea of reading net news via IMAP with .newsrc, to which I responded, do we think that's still an important use case? To which he didn't respond, but he said, I concur with Alexei with slight preference for separate ACL, no preference on same or separate property.
Okay.
Basically the same as me.
Yeah.
I can tell you that in the Jmap proxy, which is pretty dumb and does no smart stuff about keywords, I still keep the isUnread as a separate database column field because I need to be able to count on it to get the counts. So it's actually duplicated storage at the moment because I want to be able to generate the keywords property just by dumping a blob. But I still have to keep a separate copy of it for counting on because it is the one counted flag, counted keyword as well that we have in the spec.
But but count everything, says Alexei. But going back to going back to Chris's point about the reason that we had it separate, was to actually prevent you from setting scene flags in certain cases. If we don't have that need anymore, if we don't have that use case, maybe the whole thing goes away by saying the scene flag is not covered by ACLs.
Where it becomes merged with the single ACL for all keywords.
No, what I'm saying is separate from that, that the scene flag is not,
So there's no ACL that affects the scene.
No
You can
ACL
always
that
set the scene
right.
one regardless of
If we
keywords.
have no use case anymore that wants to prevent you from setting scene flags when you look at the message,
Is there a use case that wants to do that but not prevent you from
yeah, I'm not sure.
other keywords? I don't know.
So in this RSI map implementation, scene is per user, optionally shared, but defaults to per user, whereas all the other keywords are shared. There's certainly a use case for allowing people to have some of their own per user data stored about things without being able to change it for everybody in any case where you share information.
Yeah, and there are some mail stores where you're only allowed to set scene and no other flags.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay, I think it does sound like we probably want separate ACLs. There seems to be a slight majority opinion on that. Seems not huge amounts either way on whether it should be a separate property or not. I'll think about it a bit, write it up for the list maybe, and we'll see if there's any final comments on the list, and then make a decision one way or the other. Sound good? Okay. Cool. And then I think this is the final thing. Again, this has mainly been discussed on the list. What happens when you destroy mailboxes if it had messages in it? So the original spec basically said this was an error and just rejected destroying the mailbox, which is the kind of more Jmap thing because it requires all of the changes to be explicit, so the client always knows what has changed, whereas this is kind of implicit. But it is pretty useful to be able to destroy a mailbox and just remove it from all the messages. So the suggestion was we add an extra argument just for set mailboxes, where we can say if this was the last mailbox this was in, you need to either move it to this mailbox, you can say that, or you might be able to, or you can just say delete the message as well. That's the main concerns that have since been raised is that if you just omit this argument at the moment, that's the same as null, which is the same as delete the messages, and maybe that's a too risky default. Maybe if you omit it, it should be an error to try and destroy the mailbox without messages if you don't explicitly say I want to delete them. Or
I think I don't know. I find it to be reasonable default. Just delete mailbox with all messages in it. If you want to ask, you need to ask the user in the UI before you issue the command.
Right. So that.
But once you decide to do it, you want to do it. You don't want to do it like 50 commands to actually achieve the same thing.
Right, and that was what I was going to say. The thing is, it's not like the user is going to be typing in a command that says delete the mailbox. The user is going to use a UI to do it.
yeah, probably.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
anyone who does that deserve what they get. The user is going to use a UI, and the UI can decide whether it wants to prompt the user to, worry about the messages or not. So I don't think there needs to be any special incantation. If you delete a mailbox, you delete a mailbox.
So, Barry, you're just clarify, you don't think we need any extra argument at all? It's just, if you want to move them out of the mailbox first, the client needs to do that and then
Correct.
delete the mailbox. Otherwise,
The spec says that the spec should say when you delete a mailbox, any messages in it are deleted. If the client needs that behavior to be different, the client needs to deal with that on its side.
To be honest, I don't mind the extra parameter. I think I'm more concerned about the default.
But what is the value of the extra
Well,
parameter?
If you want to move all orphan messages to another mailbox, I don't know.
Well, the point is that the client knows whether there are messages there or not. So what is the value of making the client put a parameter on or not when the client can deal with moving the messages or not if it wants to?
I have an answer to this. You could have a mailbox with 1 million messages in it, And you don't know how many of them are also in other mailboxes, because a message can have multiple mailboxes. And then when you delete the whole million messages, you're not actually deleting a million messages. You're taking that mailbox ID off 900,000 messages and you're deleting 100,000 because they didn't happen to have a reference somewhere else. At least with if in state, you can make sure that you don't delete a message that you never knew was there. But you still wind up deleting messages because they didn't have a reference in another mailbox.
Okay, maybe I misunderstand what we're talking about here then. So this is, if this flag is not set, then it will still delete the mailbox and get rid of the messages in it, as long as none of them are actually being deleted.
No, okay. So when you destroy a mailbox, you remove that mailbox from well, one option is you remove that mailbox from every message that used to be in it.
Right.
Except that if the message was only in that mailbox, that is destroying the message as well.
I understand.
And so the extra argument was meant to be, if this is the only mailbox it was in, then move it to this mailbox rather than destroying it. Otherwise, it's fine because it's already in something else.
So it's
I
sort
guess I
of,
don't object to that.
I'm not.
yeah, so it's sort of like you moved it from inbox to another folder, and you want to return everything to inbox on delete. So I can live with that.
So the
I
discontinuity
don't
that
want
we
it to
have,
be the default, basically.
there's a discontinuity here between set messages and delete mailboxes. You can't set a message to have 0 mailbox IDs as a way of deleting it, but deleting the mailbox as a side effect sets the message to have 0 mailbox IDs, which is an error,
that destroys it.
which destroys it. But
Yeah,
we don't destroy messages by removing all their mailbox IDs. So it's a different way of destroying a message.
I don't think it matters. I'm not sure it matters that much, to be honest. So, okay. I guess, yes, kind of poll of people online and in the room, would anyone actually use this argument on last reference move to, or if the default behavior was it destroyed the message if that was the only mailbox it was in and that was the only behavior you got, would that be fine?
Neil says, my 2 cents, delete a mailbox deletes the messages, unless they're also in another mailbox. So he doesn't see the need for that
doesn't see the need for the
parameter, which is how I feel, but I don't object to having it.
I can find all the messages that are only in this mailbox and no other with a single search command, right?
Yes.
Okay. So that's probably, yeah. I mean, if you really want the behavior you want, you can add an extra command. So I'm a bit ambivalent. I can live with extra flag, right? But
Sure. But at the same time, adding stuff that no one's going to use is a waste of time.
Right. The other side of it, of course, is the client can decide whether it wants this feature or not. So there you go.
Okay.
So servers have to support it, clients don't.
Yeah. Okay. So it doesn't seem to be anyone that here. So I think it was someone from Linagora that was concerned for the default deleted messages, but it doesn't sound like anyone else is concerned. So I'd say that's probably still rough consensus. That's fine. I'll do a final call on the list with, again, summary of that. But I'm leaning towards maybe just omitting the whole argument, as if no one's going to use it, what's the point?
Chris says, I think a reference to the trash folder is an interesting value for that parameter. That's exactly what Pete was thinking. Pete comes up to the microphone. He has a voice.
Pete Resnick. If I'm implementing trash as a UI element, if I delete a message from a single mailbox, even if it belongs to multiple mailboxes, does that UI-wise make a copy in the trash or not? What am I exposing to the user? Am I exposing multiple mailbox existence, or is it multiple messages that happen to all point to the same message?
So IMAP is a very odd thing with implementing a client-side trash folder. And Jmap doesn't change that. There's still, if you have not retrieved the message to the client, you can't put it in a client-side trash folder.
Well, the
Right. So any reasonable IMAP implementation is going to have a server-side trash folder for
Right.
that reason.
So if I've got a server-side trash folder
yes,
and a message in multiple mailboxes, not the trash folder.
Yep.
And I go into one mailbox
Yep.
and I delete the message.
Yep.
What is the user experience supposed to be like? What am I exposed to
so
the protocol?
this would depend on your client, but I would expect it, if it's actually labeled delete, I would expect it basically to remove it from that mailbox and add it to the trash. But it's also in the other mailboxes. And if you empty your trash, it wouldn't delete it from the other mailboxes. It would just remove the trash copy.
So the user experience is those are copies, even though by
All
by
their
nature-
flags are the same. They are the same ID. So yes.
So given that, if I delete the mailbox,
Mhm.
one choice, well, one choice is, that's the problem. One choice is to say to delete the mailbox is to remove this mailbox from the messages and add trash to them. Right? That would be one way to implement, and then I don't have to worry about this move it on last reference, because if the user sees that as deleting this mailbox deletes all these messages, maybe they all move to the
Well,
trash.
I mean, the client can obviously do that beforehand. It can make sure it moves everything out to the trash before
That's
it
right.
deletes it.
The,
Yes.
the operation becomes a add trash to all these messages, remove this mailbox from all these messages. That's what delete the mailbox is.
And the
Well-
only issue with that is if you have a limited size trash folder, then you can wind up flushing your trash with messages that
Mhm.
you didn't really need to trash. There's some stuff from Jabber. Robert says, wouldn't an on last reference move to imply an account global lock on all messages for this operation? Sorry, meant for all messages within at least this mailbox.
Well,
And then there's something else, but I'll wait for.
I mean,
Alexei says depends whether it's atomic.
a single method call. It's the method calls must be serializable. So potentially, yes, within the method call, you would need to lock the account while you're processing those.
And Neil says maybe deleting a mailbox should move the whole mailbox to be a sub mailbox of the trash can.
You can already do that by just setting the mailbox as a subfolder of trash folder. So I don't think that needs to be. That's different to deleting the mailbox. Okay. Alexei?
All of these operations can already be done through other
Yes.
methods. So maybe we just need some text around this saying that the default behavior, you just, you delete all messages and you delete the mailbox. It's all gone. If you want this, do this. If you want to move mailbox and the trash, do this. If
Yeah.
you want to move into trash, do that.
Yep. That's
Chris
Probably
responds to Robert, says it could be implemented with a conditional store on the messages list of folders as an alternative to global lock.
okay. I'll send this around the list once more time, but oh, Pete's got another comment. Yeah, this is definitely bike shedding at this point.
One other solution to this problem is destroying a mailbox is not an operation, right? You want to destroy a mailbox, you search for messages that have that mailbox and say, remove that mailbox from those messages.
But you need to be able to have
You
a
want
mailbox.
that message, right, you want that mailbox either to be in a list of mailboxes with 0 messages or
Oh.
not.
Yeah,
Thank you.
people definitely have mailboxes with 0 messages in it, and
Well,
that's
right.
a part of their workflow. Like it will
But
have messages
yeah,
at some
people
point.
do
and-
keep them
yeah.
around. yes.
Okay, that's probably enough bike shedding on that. It doesn't seem like it really matters too much either way, based on what was said. So we'll come up with a solution.
Hey, Pete, you could have an anti-message, which if you moved into a mailbox, made it -1 and then it removed from the list.
Yeah. Okay, I think those are all the specific issues I thought we should discuss. Does anyone have any other particular ones they want to bring up in this session?
can try to go through my notes, Some of your changes, especially about sorting, they hand wave about how we sort. I think that needs to be specified, and we have a collation registry for this, or at least, prescribe a default sort order, I think, using Unicode. And there is also in some places you say it's case insensitive, and for Unicode, oh my God, you just made John Clancy very,
Right,
very
Well,
angry.
you need language tagging to do sorts.
The
Which
only
is
no
what collation does,
the case
I know-
insensitive is only I believe the only place that's mentioned is in text search, and it's not as a must. It's as a advice for things to try and match, because the search is specifically not.
You still need to specify how this is done.
No, because the search is specifically not absolutely defined, because the indexing is going to be different, like Gmail's indexing or Fastmail's indexing. No, they're not going to change their
I
indexing.
think you need to specify. We have enough stupid IMAP implementations as it is, and searches. I think it would be nice to recommend that, sensible thing for people to do, and people can improve.
We should put in there expected search behavior, realizing that some implementations will do it differently.
Yes,
But we should have a reasonable expected behavior that's documented.
that's kind of what's
I mean,
documented.
that's what
but,
happens there are IMAP implementations that do fuzzy searches even if you don't ask for them and stuff like that.
But that's sort of within the expectations, because it's more, user visible thing.
Right.
But saying that, and by the way, if you're doing case insensitive, this is what we meant.
Okay.
I think that's a useful thing to say.
Sure, I'll have to double check. I don't think there's anywhere.
I can
I'm sure
probably
you can-
send you some
yeah.
text or pointers to where.
We'll check that. The header names, yes, are lowercase, but they're ASCII only from RFC 5322 anyway, so it doesn't matter.
So ASCII only, you're in good shape by saying case
Yep.
sensitive or case insensitive. It's only the UTF-8 that you have a problem.
Yeah, I actually don't think there's anywhere where that's mandated, but I'll check again.
Actually, this reminds me, there is another issue with your searching for header fields, especially searching
Yes.
for values that for header fields you don't know the syntax of. The document says you first decode them to UTF-8, which if you
Right.
don't know the syntax, you cannot do this. You probably won't, even if it looks like, RFC 2231 encoded word, you shouldn't be touching it, because you probably should just search for it as specified.
But if you're searching for like,
Totally not expected behavior. If I have a subject line that
No, I'm not talking, no, for header fields, you don't understand. This is like,
okay,
do you have an
my
example?
anti-spam engine
Okay.
added X dash, anti-spam, not score, but I don't know, keyword or whatever.
Mhm.
but so if you have the encoding,
Right.
it's still, I think, expected behavior is still going to be to decode the field. It would be very unexpected.
No,
My
but
anti-spam
no.
engine-
Like RFC 2231 is not defined for header field. It's not generic. It doesn't apply generically to all header fields.
I understand.
It only applies to non-header fields. So I think
But
it's like if you want to search for message ID.
So realistically, if you had a Russian anti-spam engine that put in an anti-spam message that said in Russian, this is a pile of junk, and you were searching for that, you would expect to find it, not expect to have it fail to find it because you didn't decode the field. Even though it's kind of non-standard behavior, it's still common to encode an arbitrary field. Pete,
Yeah, I don't think you
let's-
should. Yeah.
Let's hear Pete's comment. Alexei says, don't mess with stuff you don't understand.
So I know there are clients, for a fact, that do 2231 processing over anything they're going to display,
Yes.
no matter what.
That's my point.
Now, should that reflect itself in search? I don't know, but clients do that. Clients just go ahead and eat everything. So
And I just think that if you don't decode the fields, you get user surprise.
No, you typically, if you want to search for a specific, so if there is a fixed small set of fields that we know about, like from, date, subject, to CC, decoding there is absolutely fine because they are well specified, they are structured header fields. Everything you don't know about is unstructured. That's why don't mess with unstructured ones, which
as
is everything else,
But as
basically.
Pete says, it's done. It happens. And it's well defined enough that if you look at one of these fields, you know it's been encoded and you know how to decode it. So
Well, even
putting our heads
even
in
in
the sand and
CIF,
saying,
we have actually an extension where you can say, I want to search as specified without decoding, or I want to search for decoded value. So I'm saying that we might need a knob for this.
I'll buy that.
To control that.
I'll buy that.
Okay, do you want to raise an issue on GitHub with that? And you have other notes as well, I believe. If you want to.
I mean, the other alternative is we can just say it's a quality of implementation issue. A client, a server that doesn't do the decoding when the users of that server expect it might become unpopular. Who knows? But I wouldn't mind having a knob.
I think generally, ideally, when you fetch the header, it's going to decode it such that it displays as the user expects it to display. And if you search, it matches what the user saw when they
If
were.
it has a structure you don't understand, if it's not for display, you might fetch it for other reasons because you want to search,
I think we have an answer.
Okay.
Anything else? Anybody on Jabber have anything they want to chat about? Oh, Alexei has something else.
I think we decided that all the Jmap keywords will be starting with $, but in IMAP, it's actually not a requirement.
It's not all, but all we're doing is mapping the 4 system keywords from IMAP. Instead of being /scene /stuff, it's $, scene, $, flag,
You
etc.
have, I think,
So they're consistent.
when you're doing search for various things, you include $ keyword in there. So maybe you should be a bit more careful saying that.
Or that's the name of the keyword is $flagged.
No, it was as an example of syntax. It says $ keyword as opposed. It's not the name of keyword.
Oh yeah,
So just
the editorial.
be a bit,
Yes.
be a bit
Yep.
careful.
Yep. That's probably confusing. Yep. We'll try and change that.
Alexei continues to look at his notes.
I think you have a minor thing. I can send it in email. When deciding for message submission, what's the primary, what you are going to put in mail from by default. You assume that sender can have multiple values. I don't think sender can have, only from can have multiple values. Senders can't. I mean, it's sort of the way it's worded. You take the first one even from the sender, but in the sender you can only have one. So I mean, it's a minor thing.
The past version of the message. Yeah.
There is some text about forbidding messages with the same message ID in certain cases. I'm slightly uncomfortable with this.
Where I suspect this
I
might
wonder
be
if
that
this is
confusion.
email ID and message
Yeah,
ID
I think this is
confusion.
The whole reason we're going to rename message to email.
email ID that can't be the same.
If that is what's the case, it's a good data point for saying we should definitely rename it.
Yeah, because I thought, okay, well, some people want to preserve all copies of messages.
Yes.
Some of them go through mailing lists.
You can definitely
some of them
have-
go direct. You will have duplication,
Yes.
so you have to be,
Yes. I don't believe there's anywhere it says you can't have 2 messages with the same RFC 822 message ID. I think that's
Okay,
probably the confusion of
It may be worth having an editorial thing to say that messages with the same RFC message ID can have different email IDs if they have different content,
yes. Although
or even if they have the same content.
yes, I mean Gmail I think does not allow multiple messages with the same message ID. Is that correct? The 822 message ID.
But but
But that's
Other-
different. It's message suppression. In a
other
way.
servers do.
Even if you
allow
try, actually, yeah, what happens if you try and upload like via IMAP or something? Is it only on delivery it stops that, or is it at any point?
Neil says Gmail deduplicates them. Yeah.
So it lets you upload, and then one of them just
One
magically
vanishes,
just
yeah.
disappears.
Okay, well, anyway,
Okay,
the Jmap will certainly not forbid that. We may want to mention that it may forbid that just so Gmail can have a chance of meeting it, or we could just not. I don't know.
I would actually.
Probably not bother.
The,
Okay.
the email specs already strongly recommend that you don't have duplicate message IDs. I think that's good enough.
Well, yes, but as
In-
Lexi
in
said, there's
reality,
the
yeah,
reality
you
you
cannot-
receive stuff via message list and various other formats which are slightly different and also have the same message ID.
I don't think there's anything in Jmap that forbids the server from doing whatever it feels like at any time to your
That's
message
true.
sent.
So, yes, yeah,
if it
you don't-
decides to delete the other one, then it can still do that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
That's my point, that we don't need to
Yes,
tell people
yes.
what to do.
correct.
Yeah, as long as you don't prohibit what people are already doing in a way. I
Yes,
think that's-
absolutely. Yeah.
I think that's it.
Cool.
Says Jeff. What about drafts with missing message IDs?
I believe it's already in the spec. The server is meant to generate a message ID if you try and create one without an explicit one set in the headers. So the stored version on the server must always have an 822 message ID. And hopefully most
So
clients will let the server do that.
I don't
'cause-
have absolute control of a message ID. I won't.
Hey,
have-
Yes,
Neil.
you can set your own as well so that you can preserve it after a draft has been created if you create a new copy of the draft.
What happens if you upload a message that doesn't have an RFC message ID and then import messages on it?
Sorry?
If you upload a blob and then call import messages to convert that blob into a message.
Well, I would say it's up to the server. So one option is the server can reject it as an invalid message because it can always reject whatever you blob you uploaded as not being a valid RFC HTTP message. Or the other option is the Jmap doesn't actually rely on the HTTP message ID at all. So there's no reason why it couldn't exist in the Jmap store without that, to be honest, if you really wanted to.
The interesting question is whether the blob gets changed in that case. Import messages creates a different blob than the blob that you were given.
That is an interesting case. Yes, I don't
We probably should actually. I'm going to put a note to
Yes,
deal
we
with
should
that because
say whether it's
Um,
allowed to modify it.
yeah, because there'll be other cases where
Yeah.
it has invalid characters and stuff or invalid
Yes.
MIME encoding of headers.
It probably
And
should be
you
allowed to
want to work
modify
out
it
what you
so
want
it
to do to
can,
that.
yeah,
You
like
want to
null
preserve
bytes
it
in it or
exactly,
something.
or whether you want to change it to be valid.
Nicholas?
Hi, Nicolas. So it is like fairly common behavior that once you upload a draft to the server, which when you fetch it back immediately afterwards, and you may have seen like server-side sanitization of the content. The
Yes, the server can add extra headers to it and stuff
Yeah,
like that.
headers as well as the HTML.
On the
Typically, you
HTML.
have HTML already being cleaned up. You need things like that to actually avoid some kind of a reflective vulnerability where you upload potentially HTML, invalid HTML with one raw client, but will end up on all the other clients.
Mhm.
So you cannot trust the draft either. So you need to sanitize it.
So I mean, Jmap already has in just the core syntax, the server is allowed to return any properties that it changed when you created something. So we can just specify that it's allowed to change any of those properties, and there's already a method for it to tell the client what it changed if it changed anything. So it can.
So when upon an upload, it will immediately let the client know.
Yes, I
you
changed
uploaded and
these.
it changed you.
These properties are now this because I did this.
Okay.
Yeah. So we just need to make it clear that it's allowed to make those changes.
Jeff says importing a raw email is okay with respect to the server changing it up, since the imported email can have a different blob ID, if I remember correctly.
Yes, I think that is correct. Yeah. So that should be fine. I think we just need to specify that that is permissible in the spec. Cool. Any other business finally?
Okay, call for other comments going once.
Nope.
That didn't take long.
Hi, Nicolas again. you have any particular provision in case one of the attachments should no longer being downloadable? One of the attachment of some file, like one common example of that would be like server-side antivirus that will say you should not download that file anymore.
There's no specific provision for that at the moment, but there's two options. One option is obviously the server can always delete the message and recreate a new one with a different message ID, which is the same but without the attachment. Sorry, different email ID, not obviously 82 message ID. So
let's say you receive you have an email in your inbox.
Yep.
And that message has an attachment, and the server after the fact determine that attachment has a virus, and it will fail. Like you cannot fetch it anymore, and you should actually provide information why you are not able to fetch it.
So the server could certainly refuse to return the data when you try to fetch the blob ID. So the blob ID represents the actual binary data of the attachment. We don't have a specific error response for the server has decided this is dangerous, but we can certainly add that as a response
You can
code.
use a standard HTTP.
It's a standard HTTP fetch, so I don't know if there's a standard HTTP response for the server decided not to return this data because of security policy. No,
You can come
don't
in.
think there is. But the other, I guess the other option is, yeah, if you want a way of returning this kind of in the past message format to say this attachment. So you want the attachment to be there so then users know there was an attachment, but just to say we can't get to the data.
Meaningful error explain to the user why that file is not, why you have an error, explaining the error that could be presented to user.
So it sounds like it should just be an error if you try and download the binary data then. So an error returned from the blob downloader, essentially.
It's not that the server is failing, the server is
Yeah,
succeeding,
I understand. Yeah,
refusing
concept.
you.
Yeah, so we can definitely add that, I think, as a, yes, policy refused error or something, if you try and actually download the binary data. Obviously, if the client downloaded it before the server decided it was bad and it's cached it, there's not much you can do unless the client checks again later. That's where if you'd have to actually modify the message in some way so it got the update.
Another point is from earlier description, you suggested like a possibility for the server to decide what the client would see. Like decide like how to basically decide which body part to show.
That's something we're discussing at the moment. Yes, is being able to present that.
One question came up my mind, that is, what possibility if someone, what provision you have for forcing the client to re-download in case it doesn't have an up-to-date server decided version. Let's say the server decide like at a further time after you downloaded the body, the modified body, decide to change the content. Let's say there was a bug on the server side, how to get the client to refetch the updated blobs.
You'd have to change the ID of the message because a message like an IMAP is immutable.
Which
other than the
ID would
flags.
you change on message?
So it's the Jmap message ID,
Okay.
Which is the email ID. So this is why we're going to rename it from message to email, so to avoid this confusion. So yes, the Jmap email ID, which is just an arbitrary server assigned ID, and it's not from the message content itself. It could be, but it's
everything from the message, everything from the old message, and get the new one in.
yes, it would have to basically replace that message with a new one, which had the different.
Because you already had downloaded some other body part, let's say attachment, for instance, you'll have to re-download everything.
Not necessarily, because it depends on how the server does it. The attachment has a blob ID, which represents the binary data of it, which is the bulk of the attachment. And if your server does that by like SHA-256 of the data, which is kind of what we do, then you would see I already have that. If you download the new message, but the message references the same blob ID for the data of the attachment, so it goes, oh, I already have that cached. So it wouldn't necessarily have to download the whole attachment again.
Okay, so the blob ID are not tied to the
It's not
message.
tied to the message ID, no.
Okay.
They're independent. So yes, you could get the new message, but still keep the cache data for the attachment.
Chris says, actually, for the virus case, you want the client to know it should remove a copy of that attachment if it downloaded it. Can be done as an extension, $contains virus flag, and attempt to fetch part returns a useful error.
Yeah, yeah. There are ways you could signal that. As I said, the other option would just be to replace that message with one that didn't have the.
Right. Chris's point is that you would have to make sure that the client knew that it needed to actively get rid of this.
Well, if you replace the message, then you'll
Right,
get the
then-
push updates, and obviously if that's the only message that refers to that
It
attachment,
should do
it will
that.
flush everything from the cache. So
Yes.
It's a reasonable response. Okay, yeah, once it gets outside of your sphere domain, there's nothing you can do about what it might happen to it after that. Yeah.
John Levine stumbled in, is now signing the blue sheet, and has doubled our attendance in the room.
That's not double bit.
I exaggerate a little bit. Any other comments? Okay, back to other comments going once. Other comments going twice. And thrice, and we're done. So this is the end of the Jmap session. Thank you all for coming.
Right.
We will see you in London.
And on the list.
We didn't have many people, but we had the right people.
That's
Thank
right.
you.
Exactly. Thank you very much, folks from Meet Echo and Jabber. I know it's an odd time for some of you, so thank you for attending.
Bye.